Recall from earlier in this series that the demand curve maps out the relationship between the price that you charge for a product and the quantity of units that consumers will want to buy at that price. Now, that relationship can change. It's not a static concept. All right. Now, in the next video, we'll talk about what are the things that will typically change that moves the demand curve around, that changes the relationship between price and quantity demanded. But in this video, I just want to quickly go over what does it look like when there's an increase in demand or when there's a decrease in demand. Let's begin with an increase in demand. If I start with the demand curve, which is labeled D, an increase in demand would be represented by shifting this curve up and to the right. All right, so I'm going to just draw a new demand curve above and to the right of the original one. Call that second demand curve D prime. Now, why does this represent an increase in demand? All right, well, you can see it in two different ways. One is take a fixed quantity of units. Call that quantity Q, right? Or we'll call it QD for the quantity demanded. At that given quantity, you could charge consumers a particular price. Call that price P1 and sell all of those units. But when the demand curve shifts up and to the right, it tells you for that same quantity of units, consumers would now be willing to pay a higher price. Call that price P2. Okay? So, and that's true at every point along this demand curve. For any quantity on demand curve D, the price you could charge and sell all those units is higher on the second demand curve D prime. All right? The other way you could look at it is hold the price fixed and look at the quantity of units that you could sell. So if I take this price P1, notice that it intersects these two demand curves at two different places. One, at the first demand curve, demand curve D, the price P1 intersects at a quantity QD. But on this second demand curve D prime, it intersects at a larger quantity. I'll call that quantity QD prime. Okay. Now, that is true, again, all along this demand curve. Pick any price along this demand curve, and that same price will generate a larger number of sales on the demand curve D prime than it will on the original demand curve D. Okay, so an upward, rightward shift of the demand curve represents an increase in demand. Well, now that we have that figured out, it's pretty straightforward to use the same reasoning to think about what does a decrease in demand look like. Well, that's just going to be a downward and leftward shift of the demand curve. So if I have my original demand curve D, a new demand curve D prime, this second demand curve is going to represent a reduction in demand or a decrease in demand. And the reasoning is exactly the same as before. Take a given quantity. Again, I'll call it QD. On the original demand curve, you could charge this price here. Call it P1. On the second demand curve, you would have to charge a lower price. Call it P2 to sell that same quantity of units. Okay? And once again, that's true everywhere along this demand curve. At a given quantity, people will pay a higher price to get that quantity. On the other hand, take a given price like P2, and on the original demand curve, I'm going to now call that QD prime. On the original demand curve, you would get this quantity QD. You could sell that many units for the price P2. But now with a lower demand curve, that same price will not sell as many units. You would only be able to sell this smaller number, QD prime. Okay, so that is the basics of shifting the demand curve. Shifting up and to the right is an increase in demand. Shifting down and to the left is a decrease in demand. And in the next lecture, next lecture video, we are going to talk about what are the factors that would shift the demand curve to the right and to the left.